I'm Duncan Heath. I'm a conversion strategist here at Fresh Egg, and this training is going to cover some of the fundamentals of running a CRO campaign, but also cover some of the more advanced elements that aren't talked about so frequently. In this, our third video of our CRO training series, we're going to be talking about split testing techniques. So it's all very well coming up with improvements, ideas for improvements through quantitative and qualitative research. Without testing our assumptions, we run a really high risk of getting it wrong when we try and change things on a website. So take a look at this image here. As you're looking at it, your brain's getting new data via your eyes and your optical nerves, but you're also recalling stored models that you've got in your brain to help you interpret the image and the objects within it. You're probably seeing square A as a darker square and square B as a lighter square, but you're wrong. They're actually exactly the same colour and shade. There's actually an optical illusion here caused by the fact that your brain knows how a checkerboard pattern works. Square B should be a lighter block in the pattern, and also knows how shadows behave. You've got a mental model for how a shadow behaves. It gets lighter as it moves further away from the object that's casting it. And so these mechanisms combine to make you see square B as a lighter shade than it actually is. So when I first saw this myself, I didn't believe it. I thought it was just a stupid test that was actually trying to trick me, but they are absolutely the same colour. The only way to really prove that to myself was to run a test. So this test was very simply to use a colour picker tool in a browser to roll over it, and we can see here that indeed, actually, when you do roll over it, the shade of grey is exactly the same on square A as it is in square B. So when you first saw the image, you were probably convinced, based on the evidence that you had through your eyes and using those mental models in your brain, that they were different colours. Once you actually put some quantitative data behind it, you can actually see that is an invalid assumption. So without this test data, you can never really be sure, and this is why split testing is so important when it comes to optimising a site. So throughout the qualitative and quantitative process, you're identifying hypotheses effectively. We're trying to say, we think this is an issue, we think this is an opportunity, and we think that by making a certain change or developing a certain solution, that will have an impact. But if we're going to split test this, which we should be, you should write those ideas into a hypothesis structure. So here we've got a basic one which says if a change is made, then we expect a certain result, and the reason being is X. So to put that in a real world example, if the navigation used a larger font and a higher contrast colour, then more users will click it due to its increased prominence. And this is a hypothesis that we're then going to try and prove or disprove through a split test. To briefly touch on the idea of split testing, this is effectively splitting your audience into two or more buckets and showing those buckets of users a different experience when they come to the website, and then recording how those users go on to behave. And that could be in terms of micro actions such as playing a video, or it could be in terms of macro conversions such as adding a product to basket and purchasing. So the graphic here just shows splitting of traffic into A versus B, and then looking at the conversions of those audiences to understand which experience was overall the best. I'm not going to go into great detail here about the mechanics of split testing. There are great resources online, and we go into much more detail in some of our training courses, but it's good to have a basic understanding of the concept. What I am going to talk about in this training video is more about some of the mechanics that are not often discussed, but that are incredibly important when it comes to running a good campaign. The first element of split testing I'm going to talk about is when you want to run multiple split tests at the same time, so concurrent split testing. It's something I get asked about a lot, and it's definitely possible, but there are some really important things to know about when you're doing it. There are some risks, certainly. So there's a risk of tests impacting each other's results and skewing the data. Using up a monthly allowance. If you're using a split testing tool that has a certain allowance and you're running multiple tests, that can lead to you using up that quota much more quickly, and can cause your split testing to turn off if you hit quota. There's also a risk of lack of focus. So if you're split testing many things across your site at the same time, you might not be paying proper attention to managing problems that come up through that testing, and also reporting accurately on results can be difficult when you've got many things going on. So the first one I'm going to look at is that issue of preventing the skewing of data. Now, when you're running tests, there are a few different ways of doing this. One is to run different tests on different device types. So you might have one test that's aimed for desktop users, and so one test that's aimed for mobile. As long as you're keeping them separate and testing on different devices or different audience groups, you shouldn't have any problem with overlapping or skewing of data. So similarly, you can run tests on different audience groups, so based on traffic source. So running a test on PPC traffic as opposed to SEO traffic and keeping them separate will prevent skewing of data. You can run tests on other audience groups where there's no overlap as well. So one example here is geolocation. If you have tests running for UK versus US and those audiences don't overlap, then you can run multiple testing at the same time. It's not always possible to do any of these things. You might want to test on bigger audience groups or audiences that sit across multiple different segments. So in this case, running mutually exclusive tests is a good solution, and I'll go into that in a second. There are other mechanisms for running multiple tests at the same time without skewing data, but these are the ones that can solve most of the problems for you. So mutually exclusive testing is where you group your traffic into separate buckets, and then those buckets are then tested on separately. So it's described in this diagram a bit more clearly. You've got your total population of your site traffic. You split them into different test groups. So in this case, it's test 1 versus test 2 group. And then you show variations to those groups in isolation. So you're never testing on the same audience groups with multiple tests, but it enables you to still take a cross-section of your audience, because of that total population, you are randomly putting people into test group 1 and test group 2 or test group 3 if you have multiple, and then it enables you to run testing on a representative group of all of your users, but still get valid results. Okay, another question I get asked a lot about is how CRO, conversion optimization, impacts SEO. There are some resources out there that help, but there's not a lot of guidance out there. We can look to Google for some indication of how they like or dislike CRO. They've been quoted a few times as saying that they think it's beneficial and they are glad that people are running split testing. But at the same time, there's other resources that suggest that they want you to be very careful around how you do that, and we'll touch on that in a second. Looking at some other issues around SEO and CRO. So cloaking is something that Google have come out and multiple search engines have come out and said that they are against. This is effectively showing a different experience to search engines as you would to a normal site user. So with this in mind, when you're running tests, don't treat a search engine in a different way you would to a standard user in terms of your bucketing or the experience you're going to offer them. Now, Google says don't run experiments for longer than needed, and that's suitably ambiguous. But what we interpret that as is, if you're running a test and you find a result, try not to use your split testing tool to deliver that experience or run a test for longer than you need to once you've found results. So either hard code the winning variation or stop the test and run a different test rather than just keep it running through a testing platform. Another thing to be aware of is duplicating content. Through a lot of testing, you'll create landing pages, new landing pages. You might create a duplicate version of one of your landing pages and then send users into that new one. And it will have a lot of the same content often and have the same purpose. So you don't want that page to be indexed really. You can put things like no index tags on the page, and you can block it via robot.txt, which is important to do. Or you can use canonical tags to stop the search engines treating it as a separate page and seeing it as duplicate content. The traffic splits that you run an experiment on can have a big impact on SEO. There's nothing formally that's been published by search engines to say which version of a page they're going to index, but in our experience, if you send more of your traffic to one variation than another, that can lead to that page being indexed. So if you don't want a new variation page to be indexed by search engines, and they can execute JavaScript, so they can understand what the experience on a page is being offered to users. Don't show that experience to a larger proportion of the traffic than the page you want to be indexed. So if you're running an A/B test and your original page and your new page, you wouldn't want to show 51% or more to the new page, because then you run a risk of that page being indexed by search engines. And the last one, of course, is if you've got any questions or any concerns around with whether your tests are going to impact any SEO, consult an SEO either within your company or externally to understand if it's safe to do so. So another big topic in optimization and split testing is the innovation versus iteration argument. Should we be building bold new experiences for users, or should we be micro testing and iterating an experience for them to find the best optimal level? You consider iteration testing when it comes to remotes in this sense. So this is the same brand but tweaking bits as we go in terms of color, layout of buttons, ordering, size, that kind of thing. And then you've got an innovation from Apple, which rewrites the rulebook when it comes to remotes, and this is a bold new experience that they tested against original standard designs. Now, there are pros and cons, of course, to both, as you might imagine. Iteration testing is typically quicker and easier to get tests up and running, so you can get learnings very quickly. The amount of learning you get is typically increased, because when you're making iteration testing, you tend to be testing small individual elements. You're minimizing your variables, whereas in innovation testing you might be testing multiple different changes at the same time, and so it's harder then to break down what is having that change. But with iteration testing, there's a higher risk of test error. So when you're running more tests and greater variation numbers, you increase your chance of getting false positives and false negatives. You also increase your test durations, because when you're making small tests on a site, you're changing the user experience often to a smaller degree, and so measuring the difference between your control and your new variations takes much longer, with much bigger sample sizes required. And you'll get many tests that don't get any results because users aren't responding to that small micro changes. They're much more likely to respond to and have a behavioural change against bigger, more bold tests. Okay, the pros and cons of innovation testing. So the pluses are you can get bigger returns. Ultimately, this is what you are testing for, to get big shifts in user behaviour and get a return for the companies that you're optimising for. As we talked about, there's a lower risk of test error. And it also leads to the ability to find a global maxima of performance, and I'll touch on that in a second. But of course, the flip side of that is that there are bigger investments and greater risk when you are building tests, because you're putting more resource and more effort into designing bigger variations that require more design time, more code time, more QA time. And if those tests don't prove valuable, then you've lost a great deal more effort. As we touched upon, it's more difficult to extrapolate from the test results what it was about the changes that had the bigger impact. So if you are changing layouts, you're changing colours, language, sizing, all at the same time, and you see a net positive effect, you can't necessarily break that down and say which of the elements were most impactful. So to touch on that global versus local maxima problem, which is quite important when it comes to testing, if you are constantly running iteration, small step-by-step tests, there's a real risk of you climbing an optimization mountain, so to speak, and hitting a plateau, but optimizing the wrong mountain. So you are making changes that have positive effect, but ultimately you're never going to be optimizing the best template, the best base design, because you haven't tested those yet. With the global maxima of testing, you tend to test your big innovations, your base tests first, find the foundational experience that is the best for users, and then you can iterate onwards. So we typically advise starting any sort of testing program with an innovation style approach, and then once you've found the biggest winners, then you can start the iteration process of tweaking it and finding ever more gains. Some examples of innovation testing led to products like this. So we got the Dyson vacuum, which was the first cordless vacuum cleaner and completely revolutionised all vacuums from that point forwards, but never would have been found had you stuck to a small tweaking process of testing. And then we've got iPads and Tesla. So the Tesla is a massive step change for automotive vehicles, where again people were in the industry tweaking things in traditional cars around driver aids and electric windows and all these little things, but Tesla came along and said, actually, we're going to completely rewrite the rule book and change how a car is built from the ground up. So some session takeaways here. It's possible to run multiple tests at the same time, and I'd encourage it, but precautions need to be taken whilst you're doing it, and you really need to be careful not to skew your data and increase your error rates. SEO is really important when it comes to testing, and you need to be aware of how split testing can impact your search performance, and consult an SEO specialist where necessary. Testing programs should really start with an innovative approach, so testing bold new designs to find a base level that it performs the best, after which you can run more iterative testing to refine over time.